welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. This is your host, Missa Gallivan, a former AVS student, graduate, and a current staff member at the school. This is episode 2 of our show, and wow, we had an overwhelmingly positive response to the first episode. Thanks so much to everyone who wrote in and told us how much they enjoyed it. Today we are tackling the subject of video games at school. At Alpine Valley School, we support the radical notion that the best judge of how a student should spend their time is, in fact, the student themselves. And given that level of freedom, kids don't always pick activities that look particularly educational. Or even if they do look like learning, it's not always substantive in the way that society views academics. Most people on the outside looking in can swallow kids playing tag for a few hours, or practicing guitar. But when the subject of Minecraft comes up, things start to get a bit dicey. As a parent myself, I get it. I wasn't a gamer as a student, and in fact, silently resented the gamer culture at school to a certain extent, because it meant that all my friends were off battling imaginary monsters and not hanging out with me. I was one of those kids who, on the outside, looked like a good student, and that's in very prominent air quotes, because I was always reading. Never mind that the content of these books was typically supernatural romance, I looked like I was learning something. Video games have an image problem, and as someone sitting and watching other people play them on a regular basis, I couldn't see the appeal. Things changed for me when I read a book by a lady named Jane McGonigal called Reality is Broken, which talks about the psychology of video games and the surprising number of benefits that are available to even the casual gamer. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes in case you want to check it out. I can't recommend it highly enough. Here's what I learned. Video games do provide a valuable service to each and every player, even the ones who kind of suck at it, like me. They are a quick and easy way to light up the pleasure centers in our brain, activating the positive chemical mixtures typically only produced when we do something really outstanding. Amazingly, whether you climb a mountain or bowl a perfect 300 on Wii Bowling, your brain reacts the same. The thrill of completing a challenge, or better yet, helping your friend complete a challenge, boosts your mental state whether or not the whole activity took place in a virtual world. In summary, games make us happy. Not only that, but they also act as a conduit for our human instinct to play. As with all forms of play, video games are initiated by the player and have a set of rules that everyone agrees on. Whether solitary or collaborative, gaming involves the mind in an active way. That's not to say that too much of a good thing doesn't exist. It absolutely does. And just like with any other pastime, the students at Alpine Valley School get to find those limits for themselves. Most of us know at least one student who, upon discovering their freedom to eat whatever they wanted at school, gorged themselves sick on candy and chips, until, after a difficult couple of days, they had to reevaluate their choices. Some of us were that kid. And so, too, can it happen with video games. Part of having real freedom is learning about yourself and what works for you, how you want to structure your own life. And just like learning that there are consequences to eating Doritos and Pop-Tarts every day for lunch, kids learn their own limits and tolerance for video games. What we're providing at Alpine Valley School is an opportunity for children as young as 5 to figure themselves out and make their own decisions. And even when that looks in the moment like total chaos, I can promise you that it's a huge leg up in the long run. We've had several generations of gamers at Alpine Valley School, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing one of them. My own little brother, Josh Mann, attended Alpine Valley starting in the fall of 1998 and graduated in 2009. Can you guess what he did for most of that time? That's right, he played video games. And maybe I'm just biased, but I think he has some really interesting and enlightening things to say on the subject. Here's our conversation. Hey Josh, great to have you on the show.
Hi Missa, thank you for having me.
You bet. So obviously I know you very well, but for the benefit of our listeners, I'd like to ask you to give us a brief introduction.
Sure. So my name's Josh. I attended Alpine Valley from when I was 8 years old until I was about 19. In 2009 is when I graduated. I'm Missa's brother, for those that don't know, and I've been working for the last couple years at Costco. I just recently got promoted, spent the last almost 4-ish months in training, and now I'm finally in my new position.
That's great. Congratulations. So, what was your experience like when you first enrolled at AVS?
It was very different. I mean, I was 8 years old at the time, so it's hard to say what my experience was right at the time because my memories from that time are a bit blurry. But
Sure. Is there a particular aspect that stands out for you, like when you think back on it?
for sure, yeah. When I first came to AVS, the biggest thing I remember was at first I remember being really scared of suddenly not having something to do at all times. I remember following you around a lot, and I remember you getting a little annoyed that I was constantly riding your coattails everywhere you went. But I remember feeling very not used to the freedom and not having to go to this class and then this class and this class. But after I got used to it and made friends, it was a very different experience, but something that I definitely enjoyed.
That's great. So today we're talking on the show about video games. And I remember that video games made up a pretty significant part of your activity at AVS. Is that true?
They did, yeah. I spent a lot of my time, particularly I'd say from when I was 12 to 13 until close to when I graduated, I was spending a lot of my time playing video games with many of the other students at AVS, and yeah, it was nice to have that freedom to kind of do whatever we wanted at school. And a lot of people take that kind of the wrong way sometimes, I think, and that they think it's sort of like you need to have that structure and that needs to be there. But for me, I really enjoyed being able to just kind of explore what I wanted to do, and at that time it was video games, definitely, for a lot of it.
Yeah. What kind of games did you play?
At first, we played a lot of what are known as first-person shooters, which is games sort of like Call of Duty or Halo were big ones that we played back then. Those were games that we liked to play with each other. As I got older and I like to say my taste matured, but some people's tastes mature in different ways. But for me, I grew more attached to the games with interesting stories to tell. So usually they're called RPGs, role-playing games. Games where you take on a particular role and there's characters with their own stories and an overall plot that is slowly divulged to you as you continue progress through the game, similar to a movie or a book.
Interesting. So one of the things I noticed when you were talking about that is you said we a couple of times, like we used to play. And I think there's a stigma about video games being isolating. And I'm guessing by the fact that you continued to say we, that you didn't find that to be true. Is that right?
No, they can be if you want them to be, right? It's I think one of the best things about video games is the same way it is with all forms of entertainment, whether it's book or movie. Like you can enjoy them with someone else, but you can also enjoy them on your own. So there's certain games like the Halos where you're generally playing with other people, whether it's people in the same room who you're playing with or whether it's people you're playing with online. And then there's other games, the ones that I prefer more nowadays, that you could consider more isolated, but at the same time, they're also not in a way similar to like a book. You know, you read it and then you find other people who've read it and you discuss it, right? And I do the same sort of thing with the video games that I play nowadays as well.
That's great. So when you were playing at school with other people, like in Halo or for example, what did you learn about relating to other people?
When we were playing Halo?
Or any game really that you played, whether it was against each other or collaborative, were there any sort of experiences you had kind of learning how to get along with other people through those experiences?
Sure. Yeah. There was I mean, when when we used to play those shooters together, particularly Halo, there were several of us in that. We used to play in a little, I think it was the dark room at the time. I don't even remember what the room was called way back then, but there would be 4 or 5 of us all playing together, and so there was a lot of teamwork involved. So there definitely was communication going on in that way. So we were constantly socializing. It's not like the misconception that a lot of people have, which is that you just kind of sit there and you're just mindlessly staring at a TV. There's definitely talking going on. It can also lead to disagreements. So there's definitely, I think, playing games with other people, and when we were that young, we definitely got into our disagreements and had issues. Maybe something went wrong and people are placing blame and things like that. And so you kind of have to, you build up your own confidence, you build up your own defenses against that sort of, those sort of arguments. And so you learn to kind of interact in both ways, whether it's good and the ones that are maybe not necessarily bad, but definitely there can be some of that as well.
Yeah. Do you remember a time where you had to work as a team in a video game?
I mean, we did it all the time back then when we were kids, for sure. And even when I got older and was playing them more at home, I'd play online with some of the AVS students as well, who we used to play back then as well. And we would get online, we'd play together, and there would definitely be a lot of communication. So we'd have our mics on and we'd be talking and playing at the same time. So there's always teamwork, I feel like, in video games.
Yeah, that's great. So just more generally, what do you think video games have taught you?
It's a lot. Like another one of the misconceptions I think people have with video games is that there's nothing of value to be taken from them, that you play them and it's just a form of entertainment and nothing more. But the reason it's my primary form of entertainment is because there's so much more to be taken from it, in the same way that I take from any medium, really. And in more recent years, my love of video games has really brought about my love for philosophy, ethics, all the branches of philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, history. I'm not a huge fan of history, but video games have made me curious about certain parts of history, just based on the stories that they have to tell you, some of them based on real history and some of them based on maybe a more fictional side of history, but generally there's some truth in there as well. But definitely,
those
deeper questions to life are the things that video games have pushed me towards.
Wow, those are not things that seem linked in my mind. Video games and deeper life questions. Like, that's interesting that you say that. So some people, I think, worry that video games are addictive. Did you ever struggle with playing too much?
I wouldn't say that I struggled with playing too much. I would say that simply based on the fact that I never encountered a stage in my life where I was playing so many video games that it interfered with other parts of my life. I mean, I've had a full-time job since I was around 18, 19. I always go and hang out with friends. I'm always looking to find new things to do. I love hiking. I love working out. So it's never interfered with the other parts of my life in ways like that. But I can see that there's definitely, I think, some links to video games, stimulating the dopamine in receptors in your brain. And so in that way you could look at it and see it as addicting, but it's addicting maybe in the same way as as I've said before, movies, books, right? Like if you enjoy a satisfying story, or you enjoy getting satisfaction out of completing something, right? Doing something well, then there can be a certain maybe sort of addiction in there. But I definitely think that it's something that people can control.
Yeah, well, and it's not like, I mean, I've called in sick to work to finish a book before. I mean, and I don't think anybody would say that's like a crippling addiction and I need to seek help, but I mean, it seems sort of similar.
Yeah, I think, um, it is, like I've said, that misconception that people see video games as you just sort of brainlessly staring at a screen as you're playing a game, and they just see that as this addicting thing that adds nothing to life and only takes away. Um, and I definitely don't see it that way.
Right. It sounds like it's added quite a lot to your life.
Yes, and it's not taken away anything as far as I can tell.
That's great. So, rewinding back to when you were a kid playing video games at school, did you ever have trouble fulfilling your school responsibilities because you didn't want to be torn away from the games?
At Alpine Valley School or before?
At Alpine Valley.
Well, I suppose that when I got to Alpine Valley, and for a lot of my earlier years, I didn't feel much of a obligation to take any classes, really. I eventually I did when I got a bit older. My love for video games actually got me interested in philosophy and history, and even at one point I was interested in German for a little bit, not very long, but and those interests are actually what pushed me to take classes. So in that way, some might say it distracts you from the academics or distracts you from knowledge and learning, but in my case it pushed me towards it.
Yeah. So what about like when you're in the middle of a game and you got called into the judicial committee? Was that a struggle?
No, I can't say I've ever had an issue putting down a video game for something that I know is as you said, an obligation. When there's something that you need to do, it's not too hard to pause a video game. I've never understood anyone saying that that is an issue.
Interesting. All right. So pretend with me that I am a school parent, an AVS parent who just enrolled my child, your nephew, at school. And I'm concerned because, to my knowledge, he spends all day sitting at his computer playing Minecraft or whatever instead of learning to read. What would you tell me in that situation?
I think from one standpoint, it's very difficult for me to tell you what I want to tell you as a parent, because I think it's hard for parents to hear that sort of thing. But what I would want to say is, let him do what he's going to do, and he will learn. If reading is what you're concerned about, right? I learned how to read because of video games. I was playing games and I couldn't read the text on the screen, and I wanted to know what was happening, so I learned how to read. So my advice would be to let it progress on its own, because I think if left to his own devices, he would eventually decide that in order to continue playing the games he wanted to play, he would want to read, whether it's through his peers, maybe who are playing other games, and they're reading them aloud, perhaps, which often happens with younger kids. Then he would want to share in that, and he would also be interested in reading. I think eventually, no matter what, children have a desire to learn, particularly the necessary skills for these forms of entertainment that they love so much, and they will find ways to learn those skills, whether you push them to do it or not. And often when you push them to do it, they're less inclined to do so, is my reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Yep, fully support that. So you have been to college, right?
Yes, I attended Red Rocks Community College for something like 4 years, sort of off and on, just taking a couple classes a semester.
And how was that transition for you once you graduated from AVS and went to Red Rocks?
It was fine. It's very different, obviously. It's a very different environment. I can't say I'm a big fan of sitting in a classroom for, an hour to an hour and a half and listening to someone lecture or working on problems. Certain classes I found very interesting, other classes not so much. But in terms of the transition, it was I'd say it was fairly easy, just very monotonous.
Because you didn't get to choose what you were doing? Was that part of it, or was it just
Well,
kind of unfamiliar?
I think college, to me, is far more preferable than high school and the public school system leading up to it, simply because you do have more control over what you're taking. I mean, it's not total control. You're looking for a specific degree, then there's certain classes that you have to take, and then you do have electives, a choice of other classes that you can take. So during my time there, I took some electives. I ended up taking philosophy. I ended up taking ethics. I took some history classes. I took some English classes, and all of those I found enjoyable to some degree, at least. It's heavily dependent on the professor that you get, which is unfortunate in that regard. But other classes, mathematics, anything related to science or chemistry, geometry, those sorts of things did not interest me at all. And I find that the more advanced I got in those classes, the more I was realizing that I was never going to be using these skills in the real world, because I have no desire to get a job of that nature.
Yeah. So speaking of that, tell me a little bit about what you're going to be doing at Costco in your new job.
Yeah, so I was promoted somewhat recently to the title of marketing supervisor. So some of my time, it's probably going to be about 50-50. 50% of my time will be spent in the membership department, which is where I had been working for 5 to 6 months before I was promoted, which is the department that greets the members who come in or the potential members who come in who are not members yet but are interested in getting a membership at Costco. And then the other 50% of my time is going to be spent doing what we call on-sites, and those are where we set up at either businesses or festivals and sell memberships that way. So it's a very interesting role, and for most people who know me, a very different role than what many, I think, would associate me with. I'm not a salesperson. I'm not very extroverted. I'm rather introverted. I'm rather quiet. But I've recently, over the past several years, been challenging myself on things outside my comfort zone. Like when I was at Target, I spent several years as a member of the loss prevention team, which was totally outside my comfort zone. I'm not comfortable with confrontation. I'm not comfortable with those sorts of things. But the idea recently of challenging my weaknesses and finding ways to improve myself in that regard has interested me. And to be fair, this marketing position was not my choice. It was just the position that was given to me. But it's a great opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it.
That's great. Are there things that you've been kind of, as you go through this process of learning your new job and everything, that you kind of look back and you can reflect on skills that you learned at AVS or experiences that you had that you think are going to kind of come in handy in this new role?
I feel like this is a question when all of us AVS students start talking about the school. A question that we often get is something similar to this, like, how did your school help you in where you are today? And it's a very difficult question to answer, because I look at it and say to myself, I am the person that I am today because of the school. And so it's very hard to say, did it help me in this one particular way or this other particular way? More than anything, I'd say it helped me get out of my shell, right? Back when I was at AVS to begin with, I was a very, very introverted person. I didn't talk much. I was very shy. And so it definitely helped me break out of that by having this environment where I can just hang out in the main room with people of all age groups and talk about whatever we want to. It's very free. It's very similar to any normal setting in the real world, except the issue with a normal setting like that, like, when you get older, you go to a bar and you might be surrounded by people of all age groups above 21, but you're not just going to sit down and start talking to everybody about whatever you want. And that's where Alpine Valley really helped me, and I think helps all the students in that regard, is that you have this opportunity to just sit down and talk. And everybody's it really is a family there, and that's a very cliche saying, but it always felt like that. And it never felt awkward starting a conversation, even with someone you didn't know very well, because you knew they were, if they were new, they were going to be a part of the family. And so it's just a matter of including them in that. And in that way, it helped me break out of my shell. And in my new position, now I'm in a spot where new people are coming into Costco, or new people are coming into our department, and it's my responsibility to be welcoming to them, and it's my responsibility to make sure that they are growing if they want to, and developing in the ways that they want to. And it's definitely helped me in that regard.
That's great. I totally agree with that sentiment. I used to call AVS home. We'd go off campus and be on our way back, and I'd say, okay, it's time to go home. And I didn't really mean our house. I meant Alpine Valley School. Yeah. And it was just home, and that's where my people were. And I think it sounds like you felt that way too.
It was definitely a second home at the very least.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to end on kind of a light note and ask you to share, if you can, or if you remember one, a funny story. Do you have a particularly, like a story that you like to tell about the school, or a funny story that you can remember about being a student?
Funny story. Oh, gosh.
I know. No pressure.
I mean, this, I think it's not really a funny story, but one of the things that I always think of as soon as I think back to AVS was Ari Suter, who was one of my closest friends while I was at AVS, and still is a friend. We still keep in touch somewhat often, at least. And it was the year I was graduating, 2009, and Ari, I always knew Ari as sort of this, he was like a big, tough guy, but he was like a teddy bear underneath. And I remember after my graduation, right after I'd finished graduation, I came out, and it was just so out of character for him. I remember he walked up to me, and he gave his congratulations, and just started sobbing and hugged me. And it was like, it's one of the moments I think of the most, because it was just, I don't remember ever having seen Ari cry like that before. And it was a very touching moment. Definitely not a funny moment, but I couldn't think of one on the spot. So
that's okay. No, that's good. I say funny, you tell me a story about crying, but that works. That's very sweet. That's very sweet. Cool. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I think you have some great things to say. And I am so glad to get your perspective on the video game subject, as well as just kind of what's going on with you and how AVS impacted your life.
Of course. Thank you for having me so much. And I'm always willing to share my opinions and experiences.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and take care.
All right. Thank you, Missa.
Big thanks to Josh for letting his sister put him on the spot and grill him about his gaming history. As you heard, games were and continue to be instrumental in his development and personal interests. I remember having long discussions with Josh as a kid, talking about the fantasy worlds spun in those role-playing games he mentioned, and I look back on those times very fondly. By the way, I do play video games now. I lean much more towards the Candy Crush genre than Call of Duty, but after reading about the huge benefits of gaming, I knew I had to get involved. I do also play Wii bowling with my 2-year-old son, and am embarrassed to admit that he mops the floor with me every time. That about does it for this episode of the show. As I mentioned before, I'll have a link to Jane McGonigal's book, Reality is Broken, in the show notes, which will be available at www.alpinevalley.school.com/podcast. I'm also going to include a link to the blog post I wrote on the subject entitled, Why Video Games Are So Important. Before I close the show today, I want to take a moment and encourage you, our listeners, to get involved. Send in your feedback. Send in your questions. Let us know what you want to hear about on the show. Are you an AVS community member who's constantly fielding difficult questions from members of your family? Throw those over the fence, and I'll deal with them. This podcast is entirely for the benefit of our listeners, and I want to know what you'd like to discuss. To get involved, send an email to podcast@alpinevalley.school.com. I'd also like to take a moment to plug our website, www.alpinevalley.school.com, which has recently undergone a bit of a facelift. There's some new content up, along with some great videos and other resources. We're also giving away completely free copies of our ebook. Just head over to the webpage and click on the About Us link, and you'll see an ad for the ebook near the bottom of the page. Click on that, and you can download the book completely free. It's a collection of our most popular blog posts, including the one on video games that I just mentioned, and it's all yours with just a few clicks. As a reminder, if you shop on Amazon.com, and who doesn't, right? You can donate to Alpine Valley School by simply switching to Amazon Smile, which donates money to the school every time you shop at no expense to you. Simply visit smile.amazon.com and choose Alpine Valley School as the nonprofit you wish to benefit, and then you're all set. Amazon will even remind you to visit Amazon Smile should you accidentally start buying things from the main site. It's great for the school, and it's no extra work for you. Thanks so much for listening to the show today. I so appreciate Josh coming on and sharing his story. Thanks as well to Isaac Eliason, who composed all the music you hear on the show, and who puts up with my endless questions about audio editing. I'm Missa Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode chock full of real learning for real life.